Well, what I'd love to talk about, the future of cities. How do you see the forces that will shape the city of the future? But if architecture is about improving the quality of life, then surely this is right at the heart of architecture. How do we effect that revolution, that transformation? Could I kind of launch straight in? Perhaps I could start by the briefest of introductions. You must be unique in terms of being trained as an architect, an engineer, and a historian. And you're a professor of the history of architecture and technology at Harvard GSD. You write and you lecture. You have a unique perspective. So what for you are the lessons of history in terms of the city of the future or the cities of the future?
Well, the first lesson of history is prepared to be surprised. So, because I think it was one eminent French historian, Marc Bloch, who once said that history is not about, it's not about the past primarily. It's about giving the imperious sense of change. So I think we have to expect that cities are going to change a lot in the years and decades to come. And, design, but also technology will play a role in these changes. It may be for the better, but it may be also, it may also bring problems. That's among the challenges of our time, as you know, probably better than I, given all that you've done.
If you had a crystal ball and you looked to the future, could you give any kind of shape, thought to what that city of the future might look like if it followed certain trends? Or maybe there's a crossroads, it could go one way or the other. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, let's be optimistic first, because, we have every reason otherwise to be pessimistic these days. So, if everything goes according to what we need to develop, the city of the future will definitely be more environmentally friendly, which means a greater presence of nature in cities, greater than today. I think we all know that. But the mistake is very often to forget that nature in cities needs technology. So I think the city of the future must be both more natural and more technological. And I think among the technologies, the digital provides, may provide not solution necessarily, but may facilitate, making the city more environmentally friendly and green, provided it's used correctly. So I think for me, the smart city should become a smart and green city.
I'm curious. How would you define smart city? Because I suspect as a term, it means different things to different people.
Yeah, I tend to take smart city in a broader sense than usual. Let's say it's a city that is definitely about the use of digital technology, but I think the use of digital technology will not necessarily be enough to make the city smart. I think we need the city also to be more livable. We need also the city to be about citizens more generally, participation, etc. So I think the digital is a tool. It's not the end. I think for me, I define smart as a kind of new turning point in the long history of the relation between people, cities, and technology. A little bit like in the 19th century, when networks began to appear in cities, there were changes. So I think smart for me equal a kind of broad, sweeping changes in this triangle: cities, people, technology. New technology for different cities and ultimately for people.
The effects of the pandemic, do you think that that will change cities in a different way, or do you think perhaps It's merely magnifying and accelerating trends that were already apparent before the pandemic.
Well, historians are usually better at predicting the past than the future. But I think crises are both. They are turning point, but they also reveal the extent of changes that had already begun. So I think it's pretty clear that finally, in the 1990s, a lot of people wrote that, part of our activities will go online, et cetera, et cetera. So, and actually it did not happen to the extent that was prophesied, for example, like people like the late Bill Mitchell at MIT, etc. I think now we're realizing that we can do a lot online, but which doesn't mean that everything is going to go online. It means probably that the real question is should we still do in the physical space, meeting with people, etc., etc. So that's in a way an evolution, but an evolution that has been revealed by the crisis. I think the crisis has also in some ways revealed our fragility. Speaking of nature, that, some strange virus could disrupt so globally the world. And I think we've learned probably that that very large cities have challenges that we haven't answered yet. In terms, for example, of quality of housing, clearly there is an issue. Many people, you in your Swiss castle, I myself in my smaller Parisian apartment, I think we've survived pretty well. A lot of people, it has been dire condition. So we need definitely to rethink questions like housing and, relation to a number of things like that. So
But do you think it will change the nature of the workplace?
Oh, yeah, I think, there again, some 20 years to 30 years ago, people began to discuss on the fact that the workplace would not be only the office space. So now we're getting there. Doesn't mean the office space is going to disappear, but it need to change. It need also to be articulated with other spaces. It means also that people are going to work differently, which doesn't have only good consequences because, when there is no longer a very clear distinction between private life and professional life, it's not always for the better. So there are a lot of complicated things. I would say, by the way, that the COVID has revealed that the way we manage our time is as important. A lot have been said about space, about, spatial distance, whatever, etc., office versus home work, etc. But I think how do we manage our time will be one of the big questions in cities.
And how do you see some of the potential changes in terms of mobility, and how might that combine with some of these changing patterns of the workplace?
I think mobility is going to be much more complex than it used to be. We're there again already seeing that. In traditional cities with traditional networks, for example, you took the metro and that was it, or metro plus bus, etc. Today you commuted once a day, back and forth between home and office, etc. I think we're going to live in a world which is much more complicated, in which you can go to work the morning, be somewhere else the afternoon, etc., in a more general way. And you can, using smartphone, etc., combine much more complex ways to use transportation resources, do a little biking, then take the bus, then do biking again. So it means that we have to rethink completely transportation networks, for example, because they are going to be much more fractal and complex than, the traditional way we imagine things. So it means that actually a little bit like the passage from traditional electricity utility to smart grids, which is all about how do you manage heterogeneous resources, how do you manage complex, sometimes asynchronous rhythm, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we're going to face a huge challenge in the way we understand technology and more generally urban infrastructure.
I mean, I could read between the lines of what you're saying and interpret it as an improved quality of life in terms of the city. I mean, and there is perhaps a convergence between mobility and patterns of work that could change the nature or enhance the quality of public space in a city. How do you see that?
Well, let me take a very concrete example. A street used to be only for circulation, cars, whatever. You can imagine a future in which a street, at a certain moment in the evening or whatever, becomes a public space for pedestrian and then becomes again, a street for automobiles. You can, there again, I think the fixed categories may have actually to be replaced by a more mobile way to inhabit space, more something that is more flexible, that changes according to the day, according to the season, etc. So a city which is in some ways much more flexible and mobile than what we've known. And that's going to be indeed a challenge for designers.
That's a really exciting prospect, actually. I mean, speaking from Paris, I mean, it's your mayor and her advisor who've drawn our attention to the benefits of the so-called 15-minute city, where everything is within walking distance. I mean, interestingly, London, I think 90% of the inhabitants are within a 15-minute walking distance of a high street. Could you share some thoughts on that?
Okay, I have mixed feelings, to be honest, because I've mixed, I think on the one hand, yes, I think the mayor of Paris and her team are completely right. That's probably part of the future. But guess what? You cannot leave only a city by definition is not only, if you want it only to be 15 minutes for everything you need, a village is better. So, if you live in London, it's not only to go to the high street at the next corner. You need also. So I think there again, the issue is complexity. How to weave together intensified local life and still long range relation and connection, etc. Because a city is made of both. I think we had a little bit, we had forgotten that there was the local dimension, but let's not be so local that we forget why we live in Paris or London, which is actually so. So you need actually both. You need the quarter of an hour city, but you need sometimes the 1 hour, even 2 hours, sometimes span and city. Going from east to west London or north to south, etc., because this is what makes also a metropolis.
I agree completely. I mean, it is more complex. It's richer. It's not just the concept of the neighborhood, but your line of thought also touches on the car-borne city, the suburban model, a relatively recent model compared with the compact walkable city. How do you see the future in terms of those different kinds of cities?
I think, first of all, you've got to be realistic. That's to say, we're not going with a magic wand to suppress the enormous suburban sprawl that we've built. Houston pretty much covers an area, I think, just like the province of Holland in the Netherlands. So we're talking about cities which are large as regions. So they are not going to disappear. So we need probably for the future to be more cautious about sprawl, to go back to some form of density. But truth is, we are going to inherit a huge urban regions which are not going to be compacted very easily. Take Paris, central Paris, 2 million people. The real Parisian region, it's something like 10 to 12 million people. like a little bit comparable to London. So, and those people live sometimes in very dispersed, low density and problematic zone, which is one of the reasons you need to develop all, for example, you will need to develop car sharing because you'll never have dense public transportation on so large an urban region. So you need to find other technologies to make transportation sustainable, to make etc. You need to improve, of course, housing to promote density. But what I mean is that we have to live in what we have inherited, and what we have inherited is there again, not all for the better. Not suburban Paris, as doesn't look at all like what tourists think Paris is. So it's actually, it's actually pretty disordered, extremely, there are zones with extremely low density, problems of transportation. And, for me, one of the big question is, it will be hard to get completely rid of cars. So how can we use more efficiently cars? How can we, you see what I mean? We're not going to be living in metropolis that have only metros. So how do you there again combine metro and car, etc. is for me the true question.
I think interestingly, your observation that the kind of tourist Paris and the reality of the sprawling Paris are two realities that coexist in parallel. The same could be said of a significant slice of humanity, 14% who live in slums or informal settlements, who don't have adequate shelter, clean water, power, and modern sanitation. I mean, in your studies in terms of history, how do you see that kind of future?
That's one of the biggest challenge. I think it's something like 1 billion people right now who lives in slum-like condition. And it's still increasing, even if the overall proportion of humanity is declining. So truth is, I think that's as much a technological problem as it is a political and social, because with traditional infrastructure, basically, you destroy the slum, build decent housing, but most of the population has to go very further away from the center, and they recreate slums, which is the classic thing. So you have to find lighter technologies, kind of, more agile types of infrastructure, which there again the digital may help to imagine, in order to promote a kind of gradual stabilization of slums, which is not the same as slum clearing. There are a couple of interesting examples. For example, Barrio 31 in Buenos Aires, they've tried to maintain the population while improving the district, etc. It's super complicated, but that's, for me, I think the biggest challenge will be how to maintain the population, and while maintaining the population, improve the condition of life.
I mean, my foundation's been working on such issues in India and also on the technology with MIT. And I think that there's a converging path between what you're saying and some of more personal observations about the future of decentralizing power, energy, sanitation. So I can see exactly the point that you're making about technology enabling the transformation of slums from within rather than clearing. This leads to perhaps a wider issue of globalization, the relationship between what is centralized globally as opposed to what happens locally. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there again, probably as an historian, you're sensitive to the fact that reality is seldom black or white. It's actually an infinite series of grays. So For example, today you have people who want only to think about local, completely decentralized, farmers market, slow food, etc., etc. And then you have the classic globalization, very long range logistics, etc. I actually believe that we cannot get rid of globalization. I think it's too late. And in addition, it has brought a lot of benefits, whether we acknowledge them or not. But I think we have probably to civilize globalization, which is not yet the case. Which means, a number of social and political issues, taxing multinational corporation, solving a number of issues about immigration, about, that better than I. So civilizing globalization, probably limiting it sometimes. Do we need always very long logistics chains, supply chains, or can we shorten a little bit? Sometimes also, for example, this kind of gizmo is too complicated compared to our needs. So do we need to have any technological device so complicated that you need the entire planet to be covered with logistic networks to produce it? So probably to step down, to go down a couple of notches in terms of the intensity of globalization, and at the same time promote on a number of other things, more local solution. It's clear that, food, for example, could be partly made probably partly more local, even if there again, I don't believe that food should be made completely local again, like in the Middle Ages. I think it doesn't make any sense. So that's what is complicated, is probably to find a way to civilize the global.
Antoine, you've touched on so many subjects in such an insightful way. Is there anything else that you'd like to say about cities and the future?
Well, perhaps one thing which is never forget, I'm interested evidently in cities and technology, but cities and technology, it's ultimately a political question. A little bit like design. Design is about good design, but it's also about, what kind of world do we want to live in? So I think actually the biggest question for me is what kind of city do we want? And I think this is a political question for me. We talked I think a couple of years ago about Brexit, etc. What is it you want? Big question for your country. Big question everywhere around the world. What do you want? What is the price to be
back to the
paid?
political.
Yeah, I think you've got to accept that, cities by the end, the origin of cities, at least in the West, was as a political entity. So cities are ultimately, about living together. So what do we want?
I think your finishing point is a very good starting point, perhaps for another occasion. Antoine, thank you so much.
It's me to thank you. Thank you so much, Lord Foster. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you again. It's wonderful.